Hi, folks. Good morning. Hi, Rishi. Welcome back.
Hello, hello.
Hi. Right. We'll wait for a few minutes. Usually people gather up. Let me share our. Richard, how was your vacation?
Sorely needed.
I know.
But yeah, it was good. I did pretty much nothing. And as is customary within Grafana Labs, everyone actually leaves you in complete peace. So
That's really good.
I didn't get a sing. No, that's not true. Tom reached out about pizza, but except for that reach out about the pizza, I got zero anything from any work related. So yeah, that's
Good,
pretty
good.
decent.
Yep, that's very well needed. It's good to take a break.
Yes.
Hey, Bartek, how are you?
Good as well. Trying to catch some, rest after conference. The Global Maintainers Summit was crazy time. I think it's still happening, to be honest. The second part today, but it's
Wow,
very
cool,
good.
cool. Very
Finally,
cool.
physical conferences are
Starting.
kind of getting more professional. Hopefully, that will soon not be needed. But yeah, it's actually still better and better.
That's good. Did you present?
Yeah, I was presenting and it was live. Imagine that. It was not
Oh,
recorded.
fantastic. That's awesome. That's really cool. What a change, huh?
Totally different.
I
You,
know.
you get the same feeling of adrenaline finally.
But
Okay.
everyone
Oh,
watching
sorry.
anyway.
What were you saying, Bartek? Finish what you were saying. Sorry.
Yeah, I think it's like a boost in the mood and like adrenaline when you're preparing like a live talk. It's much different feeling, right?
Yep, for sure. All right. If there are topics that folks have, let's kind of get started. We have Yana also now. Hi, Yana. Good
Hi,
morning.
how are you?
Okay. I'm just going to add some topics. I think Hui, did you want to add a topic for giving an update?
Yeah, I could add that.
Thank you. Okay, we'll wait for 10 more seconds and then we can get started.
In the meantime, how are you, Alunita? I think we didn't ask you.
Good. Hey, we're all so busy that I was just happy to hear that Richard had taken a break. So I was thinking about it. I was like, okay, it's a good time to take a break.
Stealing the idea, yeah.
It's contagious.
Highly recommended.
Yep, totally. I agree.
In particular with this complete disconnect. It's something which happened almost by accident last time. And highly recommended. So Huey, do
Give
you
a quick
want to?
update.
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Yeah, did you want to get started?
Yeah, sure.
You're the first item on the.
So, in regards to the last week's discussion regarding the scrape target update service, we plan to implement it into the Prometheus receiver that would be able to update a list of scrape targets using HTTP request. We decided that after looking into the HTTP SD config being implemented upstream, we decided to look more into it to see if we could use it for our use case. And it does seem pretty promising, and it after some initial kind of like small experiments with starting our own local server and testing it out, it seems like it does work the way that we intended. And we just wanted to give an update that we plan to use that as our scrape target update service for our project. And we were wondering when do you guys think that will be able to be landed in the Prometheus release, and if there's any way we could help to make sure that it comes out on time?
So the pull request is pending review, so any review is welcome, and I also expect a team member of Prometheus to review it this week, so that's Bjorn. And the next Prometheus release is actually next week.
Okay, Julian, can you please share the PR, link with us so that we can actually, some of us can help review?
Yes, it's on the second page of the doc, but I will put it.
Okay, I know. You had shared it last time. Let me pull it up from there. Thanks. Yeah, 8839. Cool. Because actually that change would actually help in resolving some of the design considerations and dependencies we have. So Hui, did you want to go through the pros and cons of the push versus pull, and why we have decided finally to go for the pull model? I think we discussed that a bit last time, but I think we have more clarity now.
Yeah, I could go over kind of like a summary of it, but
yeah, just a summary.
I think when we were kind of looking into deciding between a push or pull model, whether we wanted to start a server endpoint within the receiver and just push requests to it for a list of scrape targets, as opposed to just having the Prometheus receiver just pull the list of scrape targets periodically. With the push model, we thought it was just getting a bit too complicated in the design, having to design the server along with the custom service discovery tool. And there are too much development and coupling within the Prometheus receiver. And so we thought a pull model would be a lot less complicated and a lot less cleaner for our solution, in which we would not have to integrate too much into a Prometheus receiver. It would just be a service discovery tool that we have to add to the config for the Prometheus. So that's what we decided on after drafting up the design for both models, and that's why we looked into the HTTP SD config and thought it would be a great fit, as it uses pull requests periodically at a refresh interval.
I know last time we had discussed out of order problems that arise from pull. Have you come up with any interesting ideas or ways to mitigate that?
We haven't really. I think that's likely to be something that we'll try to address if we try to address it in the load balance service. The idea of gating all of the responses until all of the expected requests came in so that things were kind of synced came up. I'm also, I was discussing this with Yana the other day, and we wonder whether, as long as we can have stability in the assignment of targets, if one pod goes away and comes back, if it's actually going to be a problem. The likely scenarios where we would expect it to happen are when someone has changed the scaling, or when a pod has died and has been restarted. And to the extent that we're using stateful sets, and we're able to allocate to the ordinal position rather than to a particular pod whose ID is going to change. One pod dies and comes back in that ordinal position, and that picks up the targets that previous one had. And so there won't be a handoff from one running collector to another in that case. And in the case of reallocating all of the targets because we've changed the number of replicas, then we expect that's because we're not building an auto scaling system at this point. We don't think that's going to be a thing that's going to happen frequently enough for it to be a particular concern. It's going to be manual intervention. Someone's going to have changed that monitoring system, and for a minute or so, there may be changes in the data that they get. And unless and until that becomes a problem that we think we have to solve through more invasive measures, we're not going to solve it. Because the other problem is that the collector doesn't really provide us with signals back when it has completed a scrape. So we would be left kind of just wondering, hey, has everything finished scraping all of the stuff we've given it before so we can give it new targets, which I don't know that there's a solid solution for.
Yeah, in an ideal world, before resharding, you want to make sure that the collector flushed out all the samples and stop scraping, and then you do the reshard, redistribute the targets to the collectors, and then it starts accepting the starts to scrape again. The collector doesn't provide us that type of life cycle events.
Yep. Okay.
David, one question regarding out of order. What time frame are you concerned about? Like, are we talking seconds or minutes or hours where you could, in theory, still have out of order information coming in?
I don't know. I recall this being a problem with the Prometheus remote write. And I know that Stackdriver will reject them as well.
I think there's going to be a time window of a minute or something that we may experience out of the samples, just because there might be retries and so on. I'm not expecting it to be much longer. But if we sacrifice this rebalancing things as new targets appear, like if we are making everything very sticky to the collectors, that problem is not going to exist. I mean, we need to think about this problem. It's just not like we're compromising everything in order to implement things easily. I mean, my ideal, the ideal solution would be actually being able to flush things out, having some sort of life cycle events on the collector that we can remotely, listen to and stuff like that. So the controller knows when all the remote write samples have been flushed from the collector, and then the collector can come in and reads the new targets and start scraping again. We need to be able to do that, handshake.
I think there's also a knob that we can turn here, which is the refresh interval of the SD discovery mechanism. And to the extent that that's a very short refresh interval, the amount of time that we're talking about potentially duplicated and then thus out of order samples will be short. Right? We'll be talking a couple refresh intervals. So if that's a 30-second interval, we're talking about a minute. If it's 10 seconds, 20, 30 seconds then.
So it uses iNotify, so it should be instant.
I'm sorry, I'm talking the refresh on the HTTP GET request, not the file SD that would be backing it. Although does the HTTP SD write to file SD? I thought that just provided the response back on a channel.
Yeah, it's in memory, right?
As far as I know, it's in targeting memory.
Yeah, so the time window has a lot to do with the refresh interval, basically. The time window that we will see out of the order samples.
But you also need to look that if you have out of order samples, it does not mean that you have lost data. It might just mean that for one period, another Prometheus has scraped the same data. So you can have out of order because you have the data coming from the other remote writer.
Yeah, exactly. Like we may already have the data for that exact, I mean, it's for that, you know, timestamp or something. So it's just not a huge deal. That's why we thought that, like, let's begin with this and maybe try to address this, like, you know, it with like graceful shutdown of the collectors in the long term to make it, you know, better. That's why I don't think it's going to be a huge issue. It's just kind of make it harder to operate the collector because we are, you know, looking at some of these, you know, failed like number of like remote writes in order to, you know, as a availability metric, right? Like, so that just complicates that for sure, because not every out of the order error is actually very critical, but there's no way for us to be able to tell that, you know, automatically. So that's the biggest, I think, complexity, at least in terms of like things that we wanted to do to, you know, operate, like provide and manage, you know, collector with like some availability metrics and so on, and some alerts maybe.
I wonder if there's a way for us to detect that a failure to push is because of the out of order error and then just handle that gracefully or handle it differently than other errors.
Yeah, but it could be a legitimate, you know, error. Like we don't know the difference. Hey, is it because of the resharding, or is it because of like there was a bug and we are seeing the out of the order samples, right? There's no way for us to differentiate it at this point. But, you know, like I think when you scale up or scale down, you know that like for a period of time, you may see some errors coming from the collectors. So you know that, like, you know, it's just you're rolling out something, a new configuration. It will take a while for you to be able to, you know, get back to the same level. So I'm not super concerned because, you know, people who are making that configuration change know that like it will be a period, you know, that things will catch up. As Anthony was saying, that if we want to build this like auto scaling thing, that complicates a lot of things. Because then, like, you know, you don't have like the explicit input from the user, right? Like they will be starting to see some errors. Like we need a proper model in order to be able to implement something that auto scales.
And to answer David's question, the remote write does not have any kind of type of error. We just look at the return code. So there is no definition of the message. If you just post to anything that replied to 100 Prometheus will think that it's fine. So it's really like very simple protocol. And actually, like some of the remote write receivers they don't all reject the out of order insert. So that will also depend on who you are talking to. All the ones that are based on Prometheus, of course, will have that issue, but other might just ingest out of order samples without issues.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks.
Hey, I have one question. So, is there a way to make a HTTP call or query an endpoint to actually see which instance is actually have, you know, what targets? Because if I make a mistake in authoring, for example, a scrape job, it's super hard to troubleshoot, and there is no target UX, just like how Prometheus gives. So this is going to be even more complex, you know, with the sharding, with the multiple instances.
Yeah, the standard discovery mechanism should be able to return you the targets, like but it's not like gonna return the allocations, I think, right, Anthony? It would be nice to have a debug endpoint.
I think we certainly could, right? So the initial straw man that I put up for the URL that the service discovery mechanism would reach out to in the load balancer is jobs, job name, targets with a query parameter to identify the collector that's requesting the data. So the query parameter would filter it down to just that, filter that resource down to just that collector's targets. But certainly if the query parameter were not present, it could return a response that is instead a map from collector IDs to target sets. Is that what you were asking for?
Yeah, exactly. And there is no way today, right? There is no way to query to see the target assignments.
I think you're asking, does the Prometheus receiver currently expose what targets it thinks it should be scraping? And I don't know, unless the discovery library, the discovery manager exposes that on its own. I don't think it does. I don't think the receiver does anything to expose that explicitly.
Okay, I'll create a tracking and maybe I can pick it up as well.
Yeah, that's fine, Vishwa. Maybe you can open it up on the backlog. Yeah.
Yeah, that could be a useful thing for Z pages. I know there's been discussion of expanding the use of Z pages in the collector. It could probably fit in well there.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on to, I think, Richie, you had itemized the compliance test results.
Yeah, just as an update, because I saw 0.28 getting released, so I just ran the updated test and dumped it here. The retries is new. The rest is the same from before.
Thanks. Yep. Yeah. Is retries? So we had a discussion before that like we wanted to implement retries the way that Prometheus server is implementing with the same configuration settings and so on. But then, the collector maintainers had an opinion that we should be just using the existing retry mechanism that is available to all the other components. Is this retries, like, are you expecting just retrying things, or are you expecting the same algorithm to be implemented, the retry strategy to be implemented here?
For complete compliance with how Prometheus behaves, the Prometheus behavior needs to be the reference. I get the argument that there is already a defined behavior potentially within OpenTelemetry. We don't have a lot of written down and confirmed this must be done in this way. And let me just a moment.
To me, the clear advantage is like people, who are, auto tuning things may bring their, configuration, but the collector is behaving so differently that auto tuning may not work, for the OpenTelemetry collector. Like you can't really, expect Prometheus server and the OpenTelemetry collector to behave the same way in terms of performance. They are very different. So that's why I'm convinced that like it's okay not to support what Prometheus server is doing exactly. But yeah, like it would be nice if you have any opinions.
I mean, the problem is if you're changing the behavior of how certain targets are being scraped, and if some implementations back off of them and other implementations don't back off of them, with everything else being the same, you cannot consider it a drop-in replacement. Because your load characteristics and your back off, in particular when something goes wrong or you have overload or something, might actually make things worse in really unexpected ways. I don't have a strong opinion on if this is a fail or like a must or a should to talk in RFC 2119 language. I suggested in the issue or in the PR, which I just linked. that we discuss this within Prometheus team, what we actually want to define as mandatory, optional, whatever. If something is mandatory, I think it should be the same across the fleet. And from speaking with my OpenTelemetry head, I wouldn't be surprised if other implementations also define a specific behavior for certain failures or retries. So it's
yeah,
probably
there's like some certain like custom retry configuration settings. And that was like the reason that I just wanted to make this is, similar to what Prometheus server is doing.
So the currently defined thing, you also see this in the PR. 500s should be retried, 400s shouldn't. Julian made the very good point that 4 to 9 can conceivably be retried with probably some heuristic. Exponential backoff, as someone who's coming from the networking space, seems like a sane default, but also not super optimized. This is not currently super defined. If you have any measurements, anything which is already defined on OpenTelemetry side or other best practices, I think it makes sense to try and align across the industry, and not everyone defining their own thing.
Well, I would note that we have a pull request in Prometheus to improve the retry mechanism because it is really stupid in Prometheus. Well, stupid in the very simple, I will say, that it will retry the 500, but like forever, and it will like never drop. So we are now, there is a pull request to change that to like have more rules like don't retry if the samples are more than 1 hour old, that kind of things, which it's being implemented as an option as well. So I don't think that the retry mechanism, well, I think it will still evolve in Prometheus because we see that with some receivers it can cause issues. The goal was to never lose the sample currently, but we see that for some receivers, sometimes they just never receive the samples, and that causes a lot of memory usage in Prometheus.
The OpenTelemetry is using this library, this backoff library. It's slightly different, but we retry when we receive 500. So it's, in terms of making that decision, it's just really like 500 at this point.
Where is it? Ah, there. I'm also putting this into the so speaking with my Prometheus head on, it most certainly makes sense to also have a look at this one to see if we can just use or reuse.
Yeah, that would be great. Let us know, by the way. Like, I really want to have an answer to this before the collector is stabilized because we don't want to break this configuration.
I cannot make promises on when this will bump up from the backlog, but we have the next Dev Summit on the 24th.
Mm-hmm.
I would be surprised if it's not on the backlog. Like, I would probably just put it there tonight.
Okay. In the worst case, we're going to deprecate the existing behavior, keep it as it is, support it probably forever, but will not document it if we change it,
No.
All right.
Cool. Can we step through some of the other issues also? I think that folks added in the PRs that are related to some of the fixes that have already been filed on the hotel side for some of the tests. Again, up, I think, is merged. I don't know. Let me see.
Up is still not merged. I think
Not quite.
David's working with the author on one last test weirdness.
Oh yeah, there was one test, right, that was failing. So David had actually called that out. Okay, but it's pretty close to being completed.
Yeah, I think functionally it's there. We're just making sure that the tests are not flaky. And then
Yeah.
it looks like Emmanuel's got a PR up already for the repeated labels.
Yeah.
So I'm just starting to look at that now, which is great.
Awesome. And then invalid will also get fixed by 3116. Staleness, I think we haven't handled yet. And
I mean, if you're pivoting to pull, you should be able to get staleness more or less for free. So that's
in what manner?
well, most of the. I mean, you need to detect when something is stale, so you can mark it as such in the remote write. But remind me, do you have a cache of or val or something, or do you send everything directly once you have scraped it? So do you maintain state of the scraped metrics or received metrics for some time?
I don't think we do in the exporter. We have a queued retry mechanism that I think sits in front of the exporter, so it doesn't really know about it. If the exporter returns a failure that can be retried, the queued retry will try to send it again. But I don't believe that the exporter maintains any state about what it has sent.
Okay.
But
In this case, you don't get the staleness. Sorry?
staleness is not only when a target is down, it is also when one metric disappears.
Yep. Yeah, in this case, you don't get it for free. I thought you had some caching. I mean, maybe this can also alleviate some of David's concerns, at least if you have if you build, no, maybe not. Regarding the out of order, if you were to scrape stuff out of order, you keep it in a val and then you send it on. But okay, forget I said anything about it. If you don't maintain state in, you don't get it for free.
We do maintain some state in the receiver that may help with that. We maintain when we first saw a metric, and we maintain the previous value that we saw, so that we can try to do reset detection on time series. We may also be able to use that mechanism to store, okay, this has gone away, we should emit a stale marker for that. But I just don't think we've had anybody dig into the design on how we should implement staleness in the receiver exporter combination.
If you just keep the last one, that'll still not be enough for complete staleness, but it already gets you quite a bit, and you can, in theory, extend it, I guess. Like when you last saw it.
But just knowing what you saw in the last scrape is enough for the hey, that particular series has disappeared. Just doesn't cover the whole target.
Another thing that Prometheus is doing is that when a target disappears, we don't insert the staleness markers directly, but we wait for an extra scrape interval in case the target would be recreated by another scrape pool.
Well, we actually wait, I think about 2 and a bit scrape intervals. That also then ties into out of order handling, because if the target does reappear, we're depending on the out of order staleness marker to be rejected by the other end, which Prometheus TSTV does. But if you don't have Prometheus TSTV, you kind of have to make sure you're handling out of order correctly.
The receiver uses a mark and sweep garbage collection approach for clearing up those prior sample data points that it keeps around. So that may also be applicable. Like if we're able to say, okay, every X number of scrapes, we're going to go through and do this garbage collection. If we've removed targets that we haven't seen anymore, we can emit a staleness marker at that point. Would we need to keep emitting staleness for some period of time, or is that just a one-time we emit staleness and move on?
You do it once and move on. Like inside Prometheus, the way it works is that it remembers all of what was from the last scrape, whether it was successful or not. And that's sufficient for all of this to work. Now, the actual implementation is a little more complicated for performance reasons, but basically you only need the last scrape, whether it succeeded or not.
Okay, so it sounds like we should have the information in the receiver that we need as well. We just need to build up the mechanism.
And what we do also is that when we insert those staleness marker, I think we have the correct timestamp on them. So we don't have the timestamp when we write the actual like staleness marker, but it is a timestamp when we should have scraped the metric.
Any other questions folks have on the tests? I think there are, I think staleness was probably the biggest area that we haven't really addressed in depth yet. Okay, moving on, let's move on to David's question. David, you had an item on
Yeah, so I've been looking into trying to see if we can use metric relabeling to rename metrics in the collector, and it currently doesn't work. Mostly I'm hoping that maybe some of the Prometheus folks that know a bit more of the history behind like why the metadata endpoint was introduced and how it's intended to be used could help me out. It seems like a bug, or at least an oversight, that if I look at what's in the wall or what gets appended in the appender interface for us, we only really have access to the final metric name for a particular metric. But the metadata endpoint is generated from a cache that's populated immediately after reading a line of Prometheus. And so what this means is that if we try and look up metric metadata based on the final name, we don't actually find any metadata. And I'd like to be able to support that. I'm trying to figure out if we should change the way that the metadata cache works, or if it's even possible. Two, or maybe I'm just using this incorrectly and missing some way that it's intended to be used.
Yeah. So the first thing is metric relabel configs is a feature of last resort when you cannot fix things elsewhere. So for example, this renaming of like container CPU seconds total, that's not renaming that should generally be done. If it's a problem, fixed in CAdvisor.
Yeah.
At least in theory. Obviously, the real world is much more complicated. But yeah, for something extremely popular like CAdvisor, that should at least in principle be possible if there's an actual problem there. But the name looks fine to me. The other thing is metric label configs applies to samples, not metric families. So the behavior here is exactly as expected because this isn't really expected to come up. But it's also not safe to take this thing for samples and apply it to metric families because we don't know if that applies to every single sample that is coming from that metric family from that scrape, or if there's a mix, or in fact there's a collision on the other side. So I think it's one of those ones where, yeah, there is no solution because it can get kind of messy.
Okay. The only solution I could think of is having both the initial and the final metric name in the cache. But I don't know if that also turns into some hairy problem.
Yes, it does. Because sample names aren't always tied to metric names, and I don't often know off the top of my head know if you can do that sort of thing with a regular grammar. Because like counters, sure, the sample name ends with underscore total, the metric family name doesn't. So being able to do that generically across those it might be doable. I'm not sure off the top of my head. As I said, that's a more formal Matsy question. But yeah, the general thing is try to avoid using metric label configs. It causes weird stuff like this.
And I would also add that you had a very easy example, but one way I use metric label config is when I have a crappy library that puts like code 500 inside the metric name, and then I want to move that to a label via the metric reliable config. So the help is no longer valid then.
I see. Okay. Okay, cool. I will update the issue, and we'll probably just do some validation in the collector to prevent this case from happening. Because right now, I think it fails silently, and if you turn on debugging, it yells at you for something that doesn't make any sense. So we can at least warn people not to do this.
But the other thing to be aware of is that there's no requirement that there be type information at all in a scrape. So you should already be resilient to this, or at least treat it as unknown or untyped.
I think it does get treated as unknown, and then it gets rejected at some point within OpenTelemetry for being unknown.
Yeah, that possibly isn't ignoring this particular question. That means you're probably going to drop a whole pile of useful stuff on the floor. Just because there's exporters and whatnot out there that don't expose that. Like if someone's handcrafting stuff in C or whatnot, they tend not to add this information.
I think that actually the thing that we need is whether it's, for example, a counter or a gauge, or like, yeah, the type, the units and the help don't matter as much. But without that, I don't think we know how to handle it in OpenTelemetry.
Yeah, I think we discussed this before in one of these calls, and the best advice is treat it as a gauge and hope for the best.
Okay, yeah, it wouldn't work, at least in this case, because then you would end up with, I feel like, a worse bug, which is, I think that the initial guidance of just don't rename things is probably the right one to stick with. And then if we get a lot of complaining, maybe we can revisit this again.
Yeah. Like you could look at the underscore total in that case, but also there within some graphite naming things, there's a semi-convention of underscore total means that it's a drop wizard counter, which just means it's an integer that goes up and down, which is not Prometheus meaning of counter.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Okay, well, thank you. I'll document it and close the issue in Prometheus. Appreciate it.
Cool, thanks. Any other questions that folks wanted to discuss or any other topics? I guess not. I think we can end early then. Give back everybody 15 minutes. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.